The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
Hello and welcome to What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Thomas Nagley. With me tonight is Father William Jenkins. He's a member of the Society of St. Pius V. He's also the pastor of Immaculate Conception Church right here in Norwood, Ohio. Hello, Father. How are you?
Very fine, Tom. Yourself?
Doing well, Father. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Joining Father Jenkins and myself is Mr. Tom Condit. He is a very great friend of the program, a longtime parishioner of Immaculate Conception right here in Cincinnati. He is a very well-accomplished lawyer in the Cincinnati area. He has fought the pro-life cause for many years now. And so, Mr. Condit, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, definitely. So, Father Jenkins, Mr. Condit, we remain in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, the coronavirus that we continue to fight. And this really appears to be shaping up to be a kind of a two-headed beast that we're fighting here. On the one side, we have the virus itself and the dangers that poses to our bodily health. And on the other side, though, we have this other issue which may end up being the larger issue at play here, and that is the response to this virus from our elected government officials. I know there are a lot of varying opinions on this. There's a lot of fear, I believe justified fear, in the fact that our civil liberties could be curtailed, that there is some kind of infringement on our constitutional rights as Americans. So, Mr. Condit, as a professional lawyer and attorney at law, I would like to get your take on this in general. Do you think that this fear is justified that we have in the curtailment of our civil liberties, our constitutional liberties, by these sanctions, by these directives and orders that our governors across the nation are imposing now? So that's in general, but specifically, just last week we saw the director's stay-at-home order here in Ohio, sent out by the Director of Health here in Ohio. We spent some time talking about that in our last program with Father Jenkins, but just yesterday, actually, we saw across the border in Kentucky the Executive Order 2020-258 from Governor Beshear over there. And while the stay-at-home order in Ohio seemed to be rather benign, there were many exemptions permitted to break this stay-at-home order. The executive order in Kentucky seems to be quite the opposite. The measures here seem to be almost as severe as they could possibly be. There are very few exceptions permitted to this executive order, which restricts all travel out of the state by Kentucky residents. So, what is your take in general on the current that we see in the United States, but in particular on this executive order from Kentucky?
Right. Well, any good witness would say, could you restate the question? Because there are about 4 questions in there, maybe.
Serious issue here.
Right. So I guess my personal reaction, I think that is not it's a common reaction. You don't have to be a lawyer to have this reaction. In fact, in the last 24 hours, I've spent time with a nurse, a plumber, another maintenance man, blue-collar guys, all of them have the same reaction. I think anybody that thinks conservatively is going to have some of this reaction. And but the question underlying it all is, what are the facts?
Yeah.
What are the facts? I'm sure we've all experienced, you click onto websites of different ideologies on the internet, and you will have some radically different headlines and emphases on what we need to do or what's overreacting. So the question is, what are the facts? And maybe we still don't know a lot of the facts. I mean, medically, they would say they don't know all the facts. But I would say, to get to my personal reaction, and those of I think a lot of conservatives that I know close and not so close, is that objectively the data does not support the depth and the breadth of the governmental reaction to this.
Okay.
I got a text message today, and this is a source that I didn't pursue how trustworthy it is, but it's consistent with a lot of the data that we've seen. It says deaths worldwide, all right, from January 1st of this year till March 25th, just last week.
Yeah.
Coronavirus, almost 22,000. Seasonal flu, 113,000. Malaria, 228,000. Suicides, 249,000.
Wow.
Traffic fatalities, 313,000. The numbers are going up, as
Yeah,
you can
I see
see.
that.
HIV, AIDS, 390,000. Cancer, 1.9 million. And they couldn't resist abortion, 9.9 million, of course. So
Of course.
throw that one in. But so objectively speaking, the coronavirus is way at the bottom of the totem pole on this list of cause of death in the world.
Sure.
And we don't see, I've thought if you take some of the politicians, it might have been Governor Cuomo in New York that said, if this saves even one life, it'll be worth it.
Sure.
I couldn't believe he said it.
I believe
But
President Obama said that as well.
if that mentality was true, we're looking at 313,000 traffic fatalities. We would make people stop driving if that was true, if that was really the attitude. So objectively, there's a lot of reason to distrust what's going on here, and I think a lot of people do. So what's the appropriate reaction? Well, it depends what facts you believe. And even the experts, the medical experts, the epidemiologists and so forth, I don't know that any of us can know for sure, but there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. And I've just printed a few stories off the internet along this line. I just want to read the headlines for a few. I mean, this is conservative thinking out there. One's called Overreacting to a Serious Situation. And this was written by a dermatologist who dealt with a lot of AIDS patients during the AIDS crisis. And another one is called How Many Lives is Our National Lockdown Going to Cost? And it talked about the other reasons people may die from having their businesses go under, heart attacks, strokes, all the stress from this. Another one just called Consider the Costs. Some of these are from the American Spectator and a few other conservative journals. But I think objectively, to just kind of wind down my answer to your question, from the standpoint of just the non-legal analysis, objectively, there's a lot of reasons to question or even be suspicious, or have they told us everything? And if not, why are we literally appear to be willing to destroy the economy for the long run over a virus that's barely in the top 10 of death toll, in the world.
Sure.
So that's the non-lawyer. The other thing, or unless you wanted to inject something there.
No.
Okay, I was going to move on to the other thing you asked me, which was comparing the orders that came out from Governor DeWine in Ohio and Governor Beshear in Kentucky. Governor DeWine's order was loaded with exceptions.
Yes.
So much so that I concluded that they didn't intend to, send out the National Guard to inspect every road and bridge, as much as they wanted to have an order out there that would have some bite if they needed it. If you literally had people assembling in the streets by the hundreds and just kind of blatant violations of the social distancing norm and so forth. Kentucky's Governor Beshear in Kentucky is quite different. I mean, he had four exceptions of why you could leave the state. Thou shalt not leave Kentucky, and it's limited and it's addressed only to Kentucky residents, and it has four exceptions. And unlike Governor DeWine, something certainly close to the hearts of the viewers here, one of the exceptions was not attending religious services in Kentucky, which strikes right at the heart of us, and I think is a big problem for reasons I can maybe go into later.
Definitely. Father Jenkins, with this non-existent religious exemption, what how do you think, this hits home really for us? We have, I know, a lot of families, even very large families, who attend the church here, Immaculate Conception, right across the river. How does this impact them? Do you think that this order is something that they should abide by? Should they refrain from coming to Mass here in Cincinnati? What should they do?
Well, it depends on what the danger is, what the threat is. I mean, if Governor Andy Beshear intends to have state troopers monitoring the bridges across the Ohio River to see what Kentucky license plates go across the bridge out of the state and what Kentucky license plates cross the bridge back into the state, and he's going to be pulling them over and examining them and determining whether or not they had his, met his what should I say, his requirements, right? To legitimately leave the state and to return, well then, I would say they face a certain amount of danger. He's a Democrat, and unfortunately we've seen the Democrat governors tend to be much more tyrannical. They claim to be very liberal, but they're liberal not in the classical sense, but in more along the lines as, let's say, Joseph Stalin was liberal, or Adolf Hitler was liberal. We see that. They're all pro-abortion, right? And so why would we expect them to have any respect for any human life, especially matters of religion, faith? So the fact that he I'm sure, deliberately omitted that, right? I'm sure he deliberately omitted that exemption. Means that he intends to not accept that as an excuse for leaving his state. Mm-hmm. Remember when Governor Cuomo in New York, who was all in favor of murdering babies right after birth, right? Yeah. Remember he said, I don't want any of these people in my state. I don't want any pro-lifers in my state, he said, right? That's how they think of it, right? That's not so much Democrat as a demagogue, although there might not be much of a distinction these days. And so, I tend to think that those who are facing the wrath of Andy Beshear for leaving his state without his okay might be risking quite a bit. Under the circumstances, though, I think because of President Trump's declared state of emergency because of a pandemic, well, one can argue the merits of that, but the fact is that declaration of a pandemic emergency would, I think, exempt people from actually venturing out to attend Mass. I don't think they'd be committing a mortal sin if they didn't do so. That's why we've taken the steps we have to try to enable them to sanctify the day as well as they can at home. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I would not fear, let's say, crossing the line in Ohio, because I think our rulers have shown that they are rather restrained. But I don't have that same confidence across the river. By the way, I just heard a rumor, and unfortunately these rumors are flying around, and I mention it not because I necessarily believe it's true. I think it very well might be true, though. Because rumors were flying around up to last Sunday as to whether there was going to be a stay-at-home order issued here in Ohio, and as a matter of fact, it came to pass. But I've been told that the National Guard is gathering not far from here, actually just north of the city of Cincinnati. And they're about to be deployed to issue a very severe lockdown of everything. Possibly even many of those exemptions made by the Director of Health of Cincinnati, of Ohio. But I understand particularly churches might be targeted by it, so they might be closed. Now, we've done everything we could at Immaculate Conception to abide by the requirements of the Ohio State Health Department. It's quite an impressive list in the protocol we followed in order to be very, very observant of the intent expressed by the health director here in Ohio. So if it does happen, at least I'll have the good conscience of knowing it's not because of anything we did or didn't do. We've tried truly to help. I think if that happens, it'll probably be because of the recklessness of others who just completely disregarded the order. But I would think that if Governor DeWine imposes something like that, I understand that there's talk about it happening by this Sunday or sometime over this weekend. I believe that Governor DeWine would do it reluctantly, and only because he was being sort of pushed to do it. I don't think he'd want to do that, though.
Okay.
So we'll see. We'll see. Just the point is, we need to pray, and pray, and then pray some more. Pray the Rosary, right, and be faithful. And then whatever occurs, we have to accept as God's will, and we have to make the best of it, right, for His sake.
Father, with this executive order from Governor Beshear, it's very, very short. I printed the order off. It's only, I would say, a few hundred words long. But he explicitly states here towards the end of the order that nothing in the order should be interpreted to interfere with the governmental branches and their exercise of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so while he purposely omits our the legitimate right that we have to practice our religious freedom, he makes sure that he explicitly states in here that their government branches are still allowed to exercise their authority, and that I think raises the question of, do you believe that this, I know we've talked about this before about never let a good crisis go to waste. Do you think that governors across the nation really are using this crisis kind of as an excuse to exercise this abuse of power? I mean,
I think some governors are.
Yeah.
I think some governors are. I think some governors have gotten a good taste of power.
Yeah.
They can snap their fingers, and entire populations, are confined to quarters, under house arrest, practically. Some of the governors, Democrats, and actually some of the women governors too, seem to be very, very inclined to say, there'll be massive fines if you do this, and if you dare do this, and you dare do this, you'll pay a terrible price for it. So I think they've gotten a little bit intoxicated with the power that this has given to them, to say the least. But power does intoxicate,
and that,
especially certain personalities who tend to go into politics.
That raises the question, Father, what motivation do they have to put an end to this crisis? I mean, it almost seems that they have, a motivation to keep the crisis going.
Well, there's a certain momentum there, isn't there? And a certain incentive to keep it going. That's what people fear. They fear this is going to go on. It's going to be self-perpetuating. Mm-hmm. And not letting a good crisis go to waste. Well, we can always find another crisis if we need one to consolidate our power even more. Yeah. That's why when I say that I think Governor DeWine, I don't think he's like that. I don't think he's intoxicated with his power. I think he's very restrained, and I think he tries not to use it if he to impose it unless he feels constrained to do so. He could feel constrained because whatever it is he has given are being flouted, or because perhaps other governors are, he's being pressed by somebody, being pressured into it. So I don't know. Tom, when all is said and done, I mean, let's face it, this is a moral crisis, right? This whole thing, as I pointed out before, and I think people generally agree, at least those who have any faith, that this is a moral crisis brought on by sin. I mean, when I said that if the worst comes to pass, I mean the worst totalitarianism comes to pass, as a result of this, it'll make the virus seem to be almost like a footnote compared to the ravage of distress throughout the entire world, and as you say, the deaths that will be experienced and the suffering that will be imposed throughout the world by tyranny. But we'll have to accept responsibility for it. I mean, there are 4 sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. And first on the list is wanton murder, notably of the most innocent and defenseless abortion. Are we guilty? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Millions upon millions of babies have been condemned to die miserably, horribly, right, in their mother's wombs. By, well, I'd have to say by the American people, or in the name of the American people, right? And that's a fact. And there's no way to get around that. I mean, Donald Trump has been asked, President Trump has been asked, well, or at least people have been asking about him or accusing him. He's got blood on his hands because of the way he's dealing with this. Blood on his hands? The people who are actually raising that should be, I mean, if they had any sense of shame, they think they'd die of shame. The blood on their hands of these abortionists. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the rest of them. I mean, they're just swimming in blood, right? And they have the nerve to say that. It's incredible, just incredible, you know. But then you have the next of the capital sins, and that is perversion, sexual perversion, sodomy. That's another sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. And we have sodomites now reading stories in our libraries to our little children under the supervision of their parents. I mean, how perverted and sick can you get? And yet, very little is done about it. Very little public reaction about it. Now, I mean, this is just the latest manifestation of this. I'm sure there are other manifestations that have commenced that have actually surpassed that. But I mean, this is a long history of perversion that we have cultivated in our society. And that in some ways is worse than aborting the children, you know, in some ways. Because to send them to limbo is one thing, to send them to hell is another. To pervert the innocence of their mind. Bishop Sheen used to say that the difference between a bad man and an evil man is that a bad man profits from the bad things he does, but the evil man just rejoices in the destruction of the innocence that is there. And certainly that's what we're dealing with here. And that's why this sin cries to heaven for vengeance. And then, of course, you have the oppression of the poor, you know, the oppression of the poor, the widow, the orphan, right, and their distress. And I mean, I see the markets, I see all this money playing that is just pure usury. We've talked about that before. I mean, it's one thing to invest in a work that is a work that is going to produce some good. It's actually productive of some fruit that is beneficial to mankind. But just to play with money, like George Soros does, I mean, that's his whole life, just playing with money. He made $1 billion in a day breaking the British pound. How much suffering was caused by that? And yet he's crowned as like the king of investors for this, you know, because he was able to break the British pound. And he's played with national currencies, which has affected thousands, tens of millions of lives, okay? The value of the money is stolen from all of them by what he's done. Basically, in the terms of usury, that's in the medieval sense of usury that the church has condemned, that's exactly what happened here. And so, I mean, this is endemic, and you look at those who've made millions and millions in this way. I mean, it's nothing but money manipulation is all it is. And it's evil. It's a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. And finally, you get down to defrauding the laborers of their wages, you know. And again, I mean, I'm going to detail about that, but it happens. There's a lot of it going on. Mm-hmm. And there's so many ways that that's done. I mean, don't have enough fingers and toes to enumerate all the ways that they manage to do that. But these are the four sins that cry to heaven for vengeance, and I'd say we're pretty well invested in every single one of them. Right. We're well long overdue on every single one of those. So I can't help but think that we're in it. We're very deeply into divine vengeance here. I'm just praying that this is one warning sign from God. I'm just hoping that God is going to use this as a warning shot to wake us up. And the result of it to make us not only better Americans in the sense that we appreciate the liberties and the blessings God has given us in our country, but also better Catholics too, and make us appreciate now our faith, the Mass, and the sacraments. And God has ways of getting your attention, and I certainly hope this is simply that, God's way of getting our attention, and that will pass.
Definitely. Mr. Condit, one question that I wanted to ask, you know, if this trend does continue, you know, we've seen these at least I guess you could call them questionably constitutional at best, perhaps, these directives and orders that we've seen from our governors. If this trend continues, the orders become more and more questionable. At what point do we draw the line? If our liberties are being infringed upon by degrees, at what point do we draw the line? How do we know when we've crossed the point where we should actually take action?
Well, my first reaction, that might be for a moral theologian, which I'm not. There might be one sitting across the table from me. I think I don't know. I mean, when I look at Governor Beshear's order, look, the first time they shut down a church, I think that's it would be an amazingly brazen act by the government of any state in this country to do that. And I think part of it may be feeding into something we had discussed before we started tonight, just what to make of the order itself and what can we infer from the order. I mean, I think it's understood that with a national crisis, a state or national crisis, something on this, that civil liberties will be infringed, that the greater good requires it, right? I think everyone understands that in a true emergency. And I think the spirit of most Americans now is, okay, they'll step back, they'll accept the infringements on some liberty. It's a crisis, let's get past it. But I do think the American spirit's not going to tolerate it for long, and especially if orders like, in my opinion, Governor Beshear's order in Kentucky is sweeping and oppressive, but actually not serious.
No.
And let me give you a couple of my reactions to that as it's written.
When you say not serious, that's interesting. In what sense?
That they're not seriously trying to combat the epidemic.
I see. Okay.
There's oppressive terms here that are, again, using the word either over-inclusive or under-inclusive for what they claim they're trying to target and get done. That there's serious defects that make you think they're not serious. Let me give you an example. The very first thing in the order says residents of the Commonwealth of Kentucky are instructed not to travel into any other state except, and then it lists the 5 things. Now they're short enough, I'll just read them quickly for the viewers. When required by employment, to seek groceries, medicine, or other necessary supplies, to seek or obtain care by a licensed healthcare provider, to provide care for the elderly, minors, dependents, persons with disabilities, or other vulnerable persons, or, number 5, when required by court order. All right, so breaking that down, so it's only residents of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, right? That's the only people that the governor purports to bind by this order. They may not leave except for one of those 5 excuses. And if I understood also something I heard maybe as part of this order coming down, was that some of the surrounding states, and Tennessee in particular, had not taken some of the precautions that the state of Kentucky had taken. So they're afraid they're going to go into these infected states and then come back. But guess what? Nothing here binds residents of the state of Tennessee from coming into Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
So how are they serious about this? If they're serious, they would close the border between Kentucky and Tennessee. At this point, under this order, the only people in the United States burdened by this order, and burdened very substantially, are residents of the state of Kentucky, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, I'm sorry. All the members of all the other 49 states, residents of the other 49 states, and indeed illegal aliens and whoever, can come and go into Kentucky.
And foreign nationals? No.
They're not violating this order to come in and leave, to come in and leave, to come in and leave. But the residents of Kentucky better not leave. Now, that tells me they're not serious here. Mm-hmm. They're not serious here. And then when people start feeling that and sensing that and understanding it, I think their patience will run out pretty quickly. Another thing I note about this is that anyone who's outside the state, number 2, residents of the Commonwealth of Kentucky currently located in another state for a reason other than those identified in the previous section must, upon their return to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, self-quarantine for 14 days. All right? So only those outside the state for reasons not justified, only they must come home and self-quarantine. Everyone else who leaves for an accepted reason, well, they don't have to ever self-quarantine. So are they really serious about this? Or are they just singling out groups and kind of putting on a show here? Because I don't see any consistency. And indeed, to me, if it went into a court with a constitutional challenge, let's say somebody's arrested trying to cross the bridge to go to church, which is a separate issue, the religious liberties. If someone defended and made a constitutional challenge to whether they could even be bound by this order, one concept that prevails in constitutional disputes often is whether a regulation, it could be a local ordinance or a statute or an order like this from the governor, is the order over-inclusive? Meaning, is it binding people who do not need to be bound by it? There's no justification for binding them. Maybe there's only certain areas that need to be targeted. Or is it under-inclusive, where you're targeting specific people, and that's what I think this one in Kentucky does. You're targeting Kentuckians, but you're not trying to control the conduct of anyone else. And they're allowed to all mingle, right, the Tennesseans.
It's almost like you're trying to control the conduct of the virus, in the sense that if people leave for what Andy Bashir thinks is a good reason, the virus is going to give them credit for that.
The virus will behave.
The virus will behave itself when it comes back into Kentucky. Yes. Makes a difference. Right?
Yes. So it sounds, I mean, I guess summing it up, it sounds like Governor Bashir, on the face of this order, I don't want to look into his heart, but on the face of this order, he's trying to control Kentuckians more than he's trying to control the virus.
And do you think we could even narrow that down a little bit more and say that he's trying to control religious Kentuckians specifically? Because, I mean, when you read through these exceptions, you know, they don't seem, you know, I thought letter B here, number 2, was particularly striking. To obtain groceries, medicine, or other supply. I mean, I've been to Kentucky many times. There's a plethora of grocery stores over there. Why would somebody find it absolutely necessary to cross the border?
Well, for sales, if they're having big sales. Or if they can't find any food on the shelves in Kentucky, they might have to go to Ohio. Or come to Ohio for food.
But the point is, and I think it's true, every bridge that I know of in Kentucky, and I cross a few, there's plenty of grocery stores on both sides of the bridge. So, but I don't think you can accuse them of targeting. I mean, I'm here talking as a lawyer here, of targeting religious groups, because he says nothing about them. And there's all kinds of other doggone good reasons why people, other than religion, but religion would be one of them. And maybe the overwhelming number of Kentucky residents go to church in Kentucky and don't cross the state line to go to church. As traditional Catholics, we've got a bit of a more unique situation with who gets drawn to go to Mass here and on the other side.
It is a fact, however, that when the question of shutting things down in Kentucky first arose, the very first thing that came to the very first thing he expressed as coming to his mind was suggesting that churches needed to close. That was the first thing in line.
From Governor Bashir?
From Governor Bashir.
Now I had not heard that, so that's troubling. Sure, that's troubling.
He wanted the churches to shut down, voluntarily, evidently. First of all, that's my best information anyway.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Condit, you started the program by reading the statistics there, seemingly indicating that the coronavirus is, like you said, way down on the totem pole. But let's say it was something a lot more serious. Do you think that if this was something more serious, that it would legally justify these religious, preventing people from their religious services? Do you think that it could reasonably, shut down churches? Do you think that would be constitutional if the crisis was actually bad enough?
If it was bad enough, now you framed that in terms of what's constitutional.
Yeah.
If it was really grave, statistically obviously grave, that people were dying and some people probably getting it in church were dying, then I think it probably would be constitutional.
Okay.
As narrowly targeted and as limited as it could be. But if it really was literally we're stopping deaths here, it probably would be upheld as constitutional. But you know, look, the right to practice your religion
Be upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States, I think.
or most lower courts. I mean, addressed with it. Here the law is this: if it's a fundamental right under the Constitution. And that would be the things we know well: the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, right to bear arms. And now, thanks to the creative U.S. Supreme Court of years gone by, the right to abortion is now declared a fundamental right. Interestingly, in the last 24 hours or 48 hours, judges in 4 different states have ruled in favor of Planned Parenthood because they must be able to stay open. Right. So that fundamental right, you can't infringe on that one, see. So I think right away that may help us indirectly, because I think if they start coming at churches, we can point at Planned Parenthood and these other judicial decisions. Wait a minute, what about our fundamental? Unlike their fundamental right, which was created in the penumbras of the Constitution, ours is stated explicitly right in the First Amendment. So we certainly have a fundamental right that should be protected at least as much as theirs. And so that would be the battle. But I think if it was, you know, death skyrocketing and really just ripping through society in huge numbers, I think the courts under current jurisprudence would probably say, okay, that we're going to uphold this closure of churches, but it's really got to be targeted, necessary. I mean, the law is when you're suppressing a fundamental right, there has to be a substantial or even a compelling governmental interest, something that's real, not just feared or imagined, something that's real. And if it got that bad, then it would probably be upheld that it would be justified constitutionally, as long as it was necessary and no longer.
Well, actually, Tom, even morally speaking, I mean, the Catholic Church understands and has taught from the very beginning that there are reasons that would exempt one from the obligation to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days. And there are reasons that would require one to stay away from the church for Mass and holy days obligation if they presented a danger to someone else, or if that exposure was imposing a danger on them, if they were endangering themselves gravely. So even before it came to that, really, even before it came to some kind of a court injunction or a governor's mandate or whatever, the church herself, if there were a real and present danger in attending the Mass, the church would let her people know that you're not obliged to attend Mass, and you might even be obliged not to under the circumstances, if coming to Mass was really a real and present danger, right? Now, of course, we think back to the Roman imperial times when people would gather in the catacombs and other places under threat of death. And they came willingly. They weren't compelled to come. They weren't ordered, you have to be here, or you're committing a mortal sin if you don't expose yourself to, capture, criminal charges, torture, and death. They came out of love and devotion, so they were willing to risk that. God gave them the grace to do so, right? But the fact is that, we're talking about something temporary. We're talking about not something that is imposed by man so much. We're talking about circumstances like a pandemic, where there really is a danger of death there that is presented in this way. And the church has always exempted people because of serious danger of illness or death. So, I think under those circumstances, the state would not have to impose such a thing. I mean, what you're saying, I gather, is that the state power could impose that under the Constitution of the United States of America, right? But it would have to be truly legitimate, again, according to the terms of the same Constitution of the United States of America. But the limitation would be if the danger could be rendered remote in the church, and the church could do something to make the church safe. If, for example, what we did at Immaculate Conception this past Sunday, I think made the church safer, a safer place to be than in their own homes. where they're hunkered down together, as it were, with grandma, maybe grandpa, and maybe 2 or 3 generations under the same roof. They're going out shopping, they're going to the gas station, and so on and so forth. They're coming back. No one knows exactly what contact they've had with other people, what they've touched in the meantime. They're bringing it home, where people are all enclosed there. And so there is a certain danger in this stay-at-home order, too. Whereas in the church, we disinfected the pews after every Mass, right? We kept the distance that they required. We were even taking the temperatures digitally.
I got mine taken.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm glad you had one. and so did I, actually. Yeah, I took my own, actually. But just to try to comply with the state order and do whatever is reasonable. Whatever is reasonable. And let's face it, at a time like this is just common sense. Is what the point I've been making here is that these things are just common sense. Washing your hands. Now, 20 seconds, I don't count. But to wash your hands, to disinfect your hands with sanitizer, to stay away from, somebody who might be ill or a carrier of a disease. This is all very basic stuff here, So they're not demanding any draconian measures be taken, I don't think. But I think people were safer while they were in church, our church last Sunday, than they would have been when they went home.
Well, and Father, you didn't mention that you doubled the number of masses that
we doubled the number of masses.
So that everyone could spread out.
That's right. Even live streaming the Mass into a church, a school auditorium for those who needed to attend there for whatever reason, too. And, they're on many fronts. And we're just mentioning a few of the things we did. There are many other things we did, too, about this. So, if even if there were a state of crisis like that, if the church could make itself a safe place, again, even there, constitutionally, the state could not shut that down, right? Would not have cause to do so.
Well, I guess the question constitutionally is the state going to be in a position to analyze what every church is doing? At some point they have to be able to make a broad order. Again, it depends how much they're able to learn.
Do you think they should at least establish a protocol and say we want our churches, that's very important that we protect our churches' right to operate and have public worship. And so we're establishing a protocol we want you to follow.
That would be, I think that would be certainly well received by the church goers and I think I think the government would have a duty to do that first before they shut down if they can. But to go to the ultimate point, cycling back, if the directive just come, we're shutting down the churches, and you asked how would people react to that, at what point is it not going to be accepted? Again, if the situation was very grave and an order like that came out, I think most people would, and most Christians across the board would accept it. But not if they say, but the Super Bowl can go on. That's the point. Are you really serious, or are you just targeting and kind of putting on a show here?
Or abortions.
Or abortion clinics can stay open. Right. That's what's going to get people really upset and rebellious if they see this inconsistent or politically targeted or not targeted.
Right. You mentioned abortions. I think some could argue that abortions are a type of religious service almost. Abortion has been called the sacrament of the left. There's well documented satanic rituals and things like that take place in these abortion clinics. Right.
Well, it is interesting, Tom, from that point of view. It's as though the state power, even now, has been reluctant to deal with the supernatural or the preternatural. At least some governors closing the churches, closing the abortion clinics, the one from heaven, the other from hell. Even now, in the state of Ohio, the abortion clinics have been ordered now for weeks to close down, at least a week and a half, I guess, and they won't do it.
Well, a federal judge in Cincinnati was one of the judges that gave an order allowing them to stay open just in the last 24 hours.
Is that just in the last 24 hours?
Judge Barrett.
Is that right?
Federal court here in Cincinnati. And
That's really
there was
sad.
3 other states. I forget which ones they were. So again, ironically, that may be precedent that would help the churches if they come for the churches. Those decisions could, because they are coming after and trying to shut down a fundamental right explicit in the Constitution. And if they have found a reason to allow Planned Parenthood to keep operating and not a church, that's when I think you'd see some real rebellion at that point, and for good reason. For good reason.
And Mr. Condit, this rebellion, if things do keep getting worse, as Americans, what kind of practical steps can we take? Obviously we can get the supernatural perspective here from Father Jenkins, but just as everyday Americans, what kind of practical things can we do to fight this crisis?
Well, you're asking a guy who cut his teeth in a courtroom representing the heroes of Operation Rescue.
Perfect. Perfect.
Civil disobedience all over the place back in 1989, 1990, 91. So to me, that's I've said and others have said that's the greatest civil disobedience movement in history.
Sure.
And the most unselfish one, because everyone in that movement willing to be arrested had already been born. So what they were doing was not helping themselves. It was for the charity of helping others.
That's a good point.
And so I do believe it was the greatest and most peaceful civil disobedience movement in history. And I think that would be the way to go. Go to church and make them carry you out. I mean, if it comes to that, it comes to that. I don't know.
Okay.
Would you defend us? Well, would I be obliged to lock the door of the church to keep people out if they wanted to come? Could they make me lock the door of the church?
I don't think they could make you. They could arrest you.
For not locking the door of the church? For allowing people to come?
Probably. They'd probably feel that you're the one that's accountable.
Wow. Father, you
As you know, in this country, you don't have to be guilty to get arrested.
True. Or convicted.
That's right.
Father Jenkins.
And you can be very guilty and not get arrested.
That's true too.
Yeah. It's probably worse than the other way around. Father, you mentioned this idea. If it's justified that perhaps the church could close its doors and at least not have public masses. But if we don't, if the mass is taken away from us, Father, at least public masses, would this not be the worst possible punishment that God could send us? I mean, I think if you look back into the church's history and in the early times, we had the early Christians who had their masses in the catacombs. They went underground. They had their masses in secret and hiding. But at least they had the Mass. They certainly took a lot of effort to attend Mass, but they at least still had the Mass. They had the possibility of attending Mass. It seems to me that if things continue to progress down this road, they get worse and worse, and we actually don't even have public Masses available at all. Would that not put us in a worse state of things than the early Christians had in the early?
Oh, I think it certainly would. The church has a punishment called interdict.
Yes.
She could interdict, basically individuals, but mostly populations, even entire nations, because of some great crime committed against the church, against God. And that interdiction applied to the availability of the Mass and the sacraments. They were just banned from having access to the Mass and the sacraments. That was always considered to be one of the most terrible punishments the people could endure. And it had to be imposed only for extremely grave reasons, out of genuine necessity. But because of horrible abuses, basically. But in this case, God might be imposing that interdict on the entire world, first of all through the Novus Ordo. I mean, Francis was basically the first one to lay down the arms, right? He was the first one to precipitate, just voluntarily saying we're going to shut the churches of Rome. Not just stop access to the Novus Ordo liturgies in Rome, we're going to lock the churches down. And he wasn't asked to do that. Certainly wasn't told to do that. He just volunteered to do that. But that lasted about, I don't know, a day or two. I guess the hue and cry finally convinced him, well, let's open the churches, but people cannot, attend their liturgy. They can't really have access to the sacraments as they normally would, at least in the Novus Ordo. And then there were cases where people were trying to watch a Novus Ordo clergyman at a table through an open door of the church, and the Italian police would come and drive them off. They couldn't even stand outside and just look through the door. I mean, that is awful. I mean, it's the Novus Ordo, I understand that, but it all comes down on the head to Francis. I mean, he's responsible for all of that. And then every single diocese in the United States of America shut down. Every single Novus Ordo diocese shut down. That's what they think of their Mass and their sacraments, the new order Mass and their new sacraments. They shut them all down. They've even proposed the idea that their people are fasting during Lent from Mass and sacraments. Wow. Well, they're telling them, go ahead and eat meat anyway on Fridays, because after all, you've suffered enough. And you're doing enough penance, and it's a farce. It would be comedy and tragedy together if it weren't just so evil. And it is evil. But they're the ones who basically signaled the civil power, you can do this because we're certainly not going to oppose you. We're going to set the example. We're in the forefront. We're going to shut down. And that's the example they set for everyone. And they signaled to the other churches, hey, listen, this is the way to go. They signaled to the State House, hey, listen, we're not going to stand up and stop you from doing this, so you have nothing to fear from us. So I attribute all of this basically to go right back to Francis. He's set an awful precedent. Is it surprising? No, he's a modernist. Read St. Pius X's encyclical on condemning the errors of the modernists, 1907, Pascendi, de Medici Gregis, right? He talks about the modernists fawning almost subservience to the civil law. And the civil power has by right legitimate authority to determine how we practice our religion, how we practice our faith in this world. Read it. It's all right there. Francis is the embodiment of that. You might as well, take the pages of Pascendi, put it in a blender, and puree it, and out comes Francis. He's a modernist, right down to his DNA and RNA.
Yeah. Father, it seems to me, perhaps I could be wrong here, but it seems to me that Francis has been a bit uncharacteristically silent during this whole ordeal. But I did see one article, I believe it was posted on LifeSite, where the headline, I believe, was Pope blames coronavirus on nature having a fit over environmental damage. Now,
you know why that's really interesting?
How's that?
Well, they're saying that his Pachamama worship in the Vatican brought this on.
Yes.
And if you follow with this Pachamama stuff, they tell you that Pachamama gets upset when nature is abused, and she shakes, and she gets mad, and she has a fit. And that's exactly what Francis is saying. Nature is doing exactly that. So now you see what his faith really is. He really does believe in Pachamama. He believes that Pachamama is really having a tantrum. That's how he explains this. This is God's word. Well, unless you consider Pachamama God. Maybe he does.
You correct me if I'm wrong, Father, but it is not the religion of the Antichrist. Is that not going to be a natural religion where we worship nature, we worship man, we worship this creation? And I mean, if Francis is saying that this is the result of nature having a fit, then is the next logical step not to make reparation to nature, to this Mother Earth?
Absolutely.
Do you think that something like this will happen soon?
Well, in the old days, they just would, sacrifice children or throw the virgin into the volcano to pacify the gods who are upset. So I don't know that Francis is really ready to pull the plug, pull that one out of the shelf. But I'd say that's certainly where it's going, and we're heading right back into the jaws of this very, very hellish paganism, which actually goes there's a paganism like that of the Romans, which was, well, it wasn't an explicit worship of demons, okay? But there's a paganism that is the explicit worship of demons. And when you pull the Pachamama out of your suitcase in Rome, when you come for this synod, and you set it up for worship, and you set it up in front of the entire synod, in front of Francis, I mean, you're getting as close to the satanic as you can get. And then we'll look at the stang that he was carrying, the witch's staff. I mean, it all goes together.
Yep.
There are any number of other examples too, actually. They all fit together, though. And, Francis, I think he is the front man in all of this. Look, he's had these conferences of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. He's hosted these meetings with these big abortionists, these big population control people. These things, these seances he's been having in Rome, these synods, have been funded by Soros and his minions. They've been funded by Soros. So where do we think this is going? Where should we expect this is going? Well, I'm afraid it's sure not taking us to heaven, that's for sure. I'm afraid it's taking us to hell before we even get there, even now. So I just hope people realize that the reason why this is happening is because they've shut out God's grace, and we have to be converted. We have to repent of our sins, and we have to reform. You have to make amendment. We have to stop offending God. Exactly what Our Lady said at Fatima. It's the only answer. People have all kinds of other solutions, but it's that moral solution that is at the foundation of the whole problem. That we've got to deal with that. We've got to face that, just like Nineveh did long ago, right? We've got to face that problem.
Well, Father Jenkins, Mr. Condit, I think we can perhaps wrap up with that. We've covered a lot tonight, definitely, and we'll continue to monitor the situation, definitely, and keep our viewers up to date with any new actions that take place. So, Mr. Condit, I'd like to thank you for being on the program tonight. I find it a bit ironic. It was just a matter of weeks ago before all of this kind of really kind of blew up, that I had mentioned to you the possibility of coming on the program. We'd like to have you on the program. And I remember you said something along the lines of, well, if there's some kind of legal issue that pops up. And boy, I think that definitely came to pass.
Well, as I told you, I was on the show a couple times, three or so years ago, and I give my same warning. Don't have lawyers on your show too often.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Condit.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
And thanks for all your pro-life work, too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And for Operation Rescue, too.
I refer to that as the good old days.
Those were the good old days. Okay. Well, hopefully, by the grace of God, we'll have better days coming.
Right.
We'll have to pray the rosary and follow the laws of God and give up those four sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. That's for sure. But Tom, Our Lady really did put it in our hands here. That she basically put our fate in our own hands when she told us, "Here's the rosary. This is what you need to do. Pray, and this. If you don't, this is what will happen. If you do, then this is what will happen. There'll be peace, right?" And we need to realize that the bad news is that it's in our very dirty and bloody hands. The good news is that it is in our power to wash those hands, right? And I think the sanitation and the washing and all that other stuff is kind of symbolic of what we need to do spiritually, right? If we would just do that spiritually, that's the solution to the real issue here. Okay. So we go from pandemic to pandemonium, as I've said before, and that's what people have reason to fear. But we have to go back to God. That's why shutting the churches down is so tragic. The church has faced many, many epidemics, pandemics, and so on before. But one thing that I don't see that she's ever done is actually close the churches. Right. Quite the contrary, to get people to pray more and more. That's what we need to do right now.
Well, Father, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your leadership, your guidance on this, and thank you for all of the prayers that I know you are praying as well. Thank you for the daily sacrifice of the Mass that you offer. I think if there's anything that will get us through this, it will be the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So I thank you for that.
Well, I hope the people who are watching know that they can watch the live stream of the Mass
That's correct.
on Sundays and often even during weekdays. So please do that. Participate remotely, but spiritually. Make a spiritual communion and adoration of our Lord and thanksgiving and love for Him. Make an act of love for Him as He comes to show you the love He has for you.
Absolutely.
Astounding.
With that, thank you to all of our viewers for watching this episode of What Catholics Believe. Until next time, we ask that you all remember the words of Our Lady at Fatima, to consecrate yourselves and your families to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and to pray and do penance. Thank you, and God bless you.